Welcome, welcome. We'll just take about 30 seconds or so, minute, just to let everyone on in. But welcome and happy Sunday. Okay. Just as individuals are joining virtually, I am Jana Kuhn. I'm an alumni relations administrator for SSPI, and it has been my pleasure to get to know Victoria Paterno just a little bit. And we are thrilled to have her present for the SSP alum community on vaccines. Um, and welcome to our Curiosity Lab. Victoria, I will turn the time over to you. Oh, I almost forgot a couple housekeeping items. If you have any questions during the presentation, please put them in the chat. And then at the end, we'll go through the questions as well as you can unmute yourself and ask your question then as well, whatever your preference. And if you're ever thinking, there's something I'm very passionate about and would love to share, we're always looking for presenters in the future. Okay, I'll turn the time over to you, Dr. Paterno.
Okay, well, now I've kind of got to get back to the beginning,
Yeah.
which is, yeah, well, I saw John Rabel on the list of people, old friend. He knows how incompetent I am with computers, so I'm sure he's back there laughing at me. But it was nice to see his face, and I'm going to say hi to my daughter. Meanwhile, I am slowly getting to the beginning of this talk. Okay. So I go by Vicky. My formal name is Victoria, and I am a clinician, which means that I don't do research, but take care of people, take care of kids. And the interesting thing for me about vaccines is in my lifetime as a doctor, all the things we're going to talk about basically happened, well, starting in the end of the 70s. So I want to talk about the complicated science of vaccines, the diseases, the immunology, which is very complicated, and social media. So we've been told that we are supposed to have decision sharing these days with our patients. So it looks like the mom's on board with the vaccine, but when you look at that cute little kid, he's not so sure about this idea. He's beginning to think the risks are worse than the benefits. So we're going to try and talk him into getting his vaccines at the end of this talk. Hopefully his education won't be too late. And just to read this, I'm so disgusted with people who aren't speaking up right now. But they better have flawlessly curated statements when they do, unless they're ignorant on the issue, in which case they better educate themselves, but also they're too late. So that's kind of how I feel we are with vaccines, but let's go on. Just so you understand, vaccines are one of the greatest public health achievements. The WHO feels that there are 2 to 3 million lives saved every year. The National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program it's been in existence for 12 years. In 12 years, there have been 124 cases compensated out of 120 million doses given. And what this compensation program is, there came a point where companies were getting out of the business of making vaccines because they were not profitable and they were being sued to the point that it made it really unprofitable. So the federal government passed a law which started this compensation program, and there is a charge for every vaccine given that's put into this program to deal with the legal cases. And that has made the end result is we ended up having, again, vaccines available and more research has been done. So basically, there are 4 types of vaccines. There's the live attenuated, which is primarily used for viruses. And those are things like smallpox, MMR, chickenpox, the live influenza. There's also a dead influenza. And there's a live Sabin polio, and there's a killed Salk. So it's not used for that. And basically, they take the virus, put them through a bunch of things, and you end up with a vaccine that is not virulent. They're the inactive. Here's where you're going to see the Salk polio vaccine, hepatitis A, diphtheria, pertussis, which is whooping cough, and tetanus. Later on, we got recombinant vaccines, and finally, we ended up with we are now at nucleic acid vaccines. And I will explain attenuated coming up. First of all, just to give you an idea, today, these are the number of vaccines that are approved. We're not going to go through all of them. There are too many. But when I started, the only vaccines we gave to children were the DPT and the measles. And well, we didn't give the smallpox and polio. 5. And that's not where we are today. So just quickly going over vaccine physiology. Vaccine physiology is very complicated. And this is in general slide. Basically, you get a foreign protein, which is an antigen. And that antigen goes into a cell. The cell looks at it and it makes a T standing for thymus helper cell. There are thymus T cells and B cells, which are bone marrow. The T helper cell stimulates through the immune system. You end up with B cells, which make the antibodies, which go in the circulation and go around killing the foreign proteins. The T helper cells also make macrophages, which are these huge cells which gobble up things. And then they also make T killer cells. Okay, so this is actually the simplified version. We will look at the more complicated, but not spend time on it. So the first disease is smallpox. Smallpox is a horrible disease. And it was first reported in the 3rd century BC. That's how long it's been around. There were outbreaks in Europe in the 1700s. And during the 1700s, there were 400,000 deaths every year. In the 20th century, last century, smallpox killed 300 million people, which is just amazing. So, this Ben Franklin wrote in 1736 regarding smallpox. He had a number of children, and he at first decided not to vaccinate them. And the end result is one of his sons died. And he did it for many of the same reasons that people have today. It is hard to do something actively, and you just believe nothing's going to happen. But what he ended after his son died, he said, "I long regretted that I had not given it to him by inoculation, which I mention for the sake of parents who admit that operation on the supposition that they should never forgive themselves if a child died under it. My example showing that the regret may be the same either way, and that therefore the safer should be chosen." And what he was referring to in those days, what they would do is they would take one of those poxes that you saw, open them up, and they would do what is called variolation. That is where you make a mark on the skin. So you take the contents of a pustule, you put it on somebody's skin, and that was the type of vaccine they had. And the other thing, which is inocular to graft, and that's what was done with cowpox, which is different. So let's look at cowpox. Edward Jenner in 1796 developed the cowpox vaccine. And what he did was he took He noticed that milkmaids never seem to get smallpox, but cows get cowpox. So he ended up developing a vaccine and injecting people with the vaccine to cowpox virus, which humans don't get cowpox virus. But what ends up happening was that they got protection from smallpox. And just to give you an idea of numbers, in 1750 in Great Britain, the method that where you took a lesion and put it on someone, there was a 1 to 2% death from that. But there was a 30% death from disease. Okay. When you got cowpox, you basically got rid of the 1 to 2% death from the previous vaccine. In 1806, President Thomas Jefferson wrote a letter to Edward Jenner, and he was English, and he thanked him for developing the world's first vaccine against smallpox. Jefferson wrote that he took an early part in recommending it to my countrymen. So there's the first evidence. Well, Ben Franklin was the first part of social media in the way they did it, which was writing pamphlets. And then Thomas Jefferson went further, and he also nationally recommended, he was the president, he recommended that people get vaccinated. Now, we're going to skip 100 years. And people were getting vaccinated with this relatively crude vaccine. And in 1905, there was the first Supreme Court case on vaccines. And in 1855, there were a bunch of smallpox deaths. So Massachusetts became the first state to require that children be vaccinated for school. So we're going back to 1855. And the case came up in front of the US Supreme Court in 1905. And the Supreme Court stated, a state may enact a compulsory vaccination law. And that is important for today, that states can do this. The legislature may exempt children from the law without violating the equal protection rights of adults if the law applies equally to all adults. So now let's look into the vaccines and the question about how we do them comes up. So diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis, which is whooping cough. In the 1890s, they figured out that it wasn't the organisms, the bacteria that were causing the disease, but these bacteria were produced toxins or poisons that produced disease. And what they did was they found that the inactivated poisons, toxins, you didn't get an immune response. It was not a protein. So aluminum salts were added as an adjuvant, which causes an inflammatory reaction and an improved immunological response. So basically, they put the aluminum salts into the toxins, bound them together, and then use that as their vaccine. But first, they inactivated the organisms, and they use radiation, chemicals, heat. But it's important for you to understand that if you do not use the aluminum salts in these 3 vaccines, which I expect everybody's had, they will not work. No aluminum salts, no vaccine. And the disadvantage, because it's not a great immune response, is you have to get boosters at intervals. So that's why you're always told, you know, you go to the ER, then you've cut yourself, go get your tetanus booster, and we're going to throw diphtheria in for you. And these days, we also now throw in pertussis. And the quality of the antibody determine if you get reactivation with exposure. And just so you know, DT, you're 1,000 times more likely to get struck by lightning than die from the vaccine. Nearly all the deaths from disease were not due to vaccine failure, but mainly to do failure to vaccinate. Okay, so pertussis whooping cough is a really horrible disease. And when children get it, particularly infants, there's some things I want you to notice on this slide. First of all, how blue the baby is. And the easiest way to appreciate that is looking at the baby's lips. The other thing is with whooping cough, you cough, 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 and then you take a breath in. And that's the classic whoop. So we're going to watch this video. With any luck, you'll hear the sound. And you can hear in the background the beeps of machines. And what that is that it's showing you that the baby's oxygenation is inadequate. These babies don't get oxygen because they can't into their lungs, and they starve because they cannot eat and breathe. I personally never watch this whole slide anymore because for me, it is so depressing and unnecessary. Moving on to influenza. If you haven't gotten your flu shot yet, I'd suggest you do so. Um, the history of influenza, it's been around for a while, but it was in 1980 that it was called the Spanish flu because it started in Spain. After World War I, the Spanish flu killed 25 to 50 million deaths all over the world. And so they started investigating it. And they found antibodies against the surface of the virus. And what they did is they developed vaccines uh, that neutralize those proteins. It's an inactivated vaccine, okay? It's what was developed in the 40s. And that's the one, if you don't get a live flu vaccine, then this is the vaccine you get. And it's been around since 1950. And part of these numbers are important because you think about DPT, that's been here for over 100 years. This one has been, 70, 80 years? These are vaccines we have been using for decades. So, polio. Polio causes neuromuscular paralysis. And this is from the 50s. It's a picture of patients in iron lungs. You would get these neuromuscular paralysis, your lungs, you couldn't breathe, you couldn't use your lung muscles. And so these machines, people would get put in these machines, which would do their breathing for them. And there were lots of them. Polio was a scourge and very frightening for the world. It was kind of like COVID. So Salk developed a killed, let me go back one if I can. Okay, so Salk developed a killed virus in 1954. And there were some problems with poor control with contamination. Some manufacturing facilities did not follow how he told to kill the polio virus. And so a certain number of people actually got polio from the vaccine because of the manufacturing facilities. They had a trial run. The March of Dimes supported it. They did tens of thousands of children. It was a double-blind study, and they found out, if done properly, it was extremely effective. So originally they started in 1954, fixed the manufacturing problem, and they resumed large-scale vaccination in 1955. And now, Salk, who made the killed virus vaccine, and Sabin, who made the oral polio vaccine, were competitors. And because Sabin came like a year later with his research, he could not get funding for his vaccine. So he went to the USSR, and remember, this is the 50s, the Cold War. He went there and the USSR was willing to fund a huge trial, and they found out that his vaccine was effective, just as effective. But the problem was that this was the Cold War. And so the United States, for political reasons, did not want to use Sabins because it was thought that it was a commie plot to kill all the people in the US. So although it was a great vaccine, it was not used until the 1960s, 1963, where it was given en masse. And this is a picture. And for those of you who are older, you will remember lining up in school and getting your sugar cube. And this is a picture from the 60s. The other thing that it had an added benefit that the killed virus did not have is that the polio vaccine would be spread in people's stools, in children's stools. We all know children are not real great at washing their hands. And so you ended up getting passive immunity. Other children would get exposed to the vaccine without actually getting it. So in the 1960s, we switched from the Salk vaccine to the Sabin. And then we went back to the Salks in the 1990s, and that's a whole nother story. So now we're going to look at a different kind of vaccine, which are carbohydrate-based vaccines. This gives you an idea of the research in that. It started in the 1920s. Now, CPS, which is on this slide, is referring. Thank you, Alan. I thought I was going to get to it, but appreciate it. Oh, wait a minute. I just lost my slides. How did I do that? I should not have turned that off. Okay. Okay, I cannot get back my slides.
We can see it at least, just FYI.
Huh?
We can still see your slides, just FYI.
Okay, well, you can see them. It'd be nice if I could see them.
Yeah.
Are they down in your,
No, no. Let's see if they're there.
what's that? P.
RP.
Go to
Okay.
the PowerPoint. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. That was my daughter telling me, Mom, you're an idiot. You know you could do this anyway. No, I
Go
can.
back to the
I'm there.
full view.
This is good. So in the
Put it
1920s,
into presenter, put it into presentation mode.
you are screen. Hi, Charlie. You're screen sharing presentation mode. Where would that be? I'm screen.
Push the little button with the screen at the bottom.
Okay. See, John, I still can't work these things. Okay, so in the 1920s, they realized that the sugars, the complex carbohydrate, the complex sugars are immunoreactive. So then they started developing vaccines. But in the 1950s, they developed antibiotics, and they found that the antibiotics were more effective, and so they stopped the research. But then what happened was we developed resistance to the antibiotics. So they went back to doing the research on these vaccines. And just so you know, we're now talking about bacteria because the majority of bacterial pathogens, before we were talking about viruses, they have a dense array of polysaccharides on the surface, and they are different. Okay, so it turns out these vaccines with the sugar coating are not effective in children under 2 years of age, which was a major problem. All right, there we go. So these carbohydrate-based vaccines are composed of oligosaccharide sugars, repeating units and these sugars mask the antigens, which are the proteins, which is what we want. And the problem is that these carbohydrates, these sugars, don't activate T cells. but directly activate B cells. And if you go back to that slide many, many times earlier, you show that you really needed the T cells to do all these other things. You did get a production of a low affinity IgM, but you really didn't get the T and the B cell memory cells, so they didn't work very well. So this is to show you how these work. Under A, that's a just a sugar vaccine, where you have the sugar, you get an immune process response, and you get IgM, but you don't have the memory B cells, which we need, and you have a short-lived antibody protection. So it doesn't work very well. Then what they figured out was they could couple the sugar with a carrier protein, which would get around and get into the cell, and the cell would then make immune cells. They'd make plasma cells, and they would make T cells. So you see, going back to what we saw earlier, you needed T cells and B cells and memory cells. And now with this coupling, they now could make vaccines that were more effective and worked in children under 2. The children under 2 did not respond to the other ones. But to do this, you had to use denatured bacterial toxins. Going back to earlier, which they used aluminum, okay, which we had shown in DT that it worked. So this process developed vaccines against meningitis, pneumonia, ear infections, sinus infections. So let's see how this worked. This to me is such a wonderful study. In Alaska, what they did was the state bought all the vaccines and they started vaccinating everybody. And they routinely purchase all the childhood vaccines. So they introduced this combination vaccine, Haemophilus influenza B vaccination. And by the way, you heard the word influenza. Influenza is a virus. Haemophilus influenza B is a bacteria. They're not the same thing. And you see the native Alaskans and the non-native, and you have more disease in the native Alaskans, and that's because they don't have as good access to medical care. But you see, you've got a lot of cases. Then when you get into 1991, this disease goes up and down. But suddenly you see a drop in disease because they were getting vaccinated, which was just amazing. And in my lifetime as a physician, okay, so these vaccines came in late 1980s, early 1991. In the 90s, I started feeling like I'd forgotten how to diagnose ear infections, because suddenly the number of kids that were coming in with ear infections was incredibly, it dropped. I stopped having to do spinal taps because nobody was getting meningitis. I stopped having to admit kids for pneumonia because they weren't getting it. So it was just an amazing thing for me as a physician to experience. Okay, so now we're into DNA-based vaccines. We consider these our third-generation vaccines, and they contain DNA that codes for the pathogens. And our cells manufacture these foreign proteins that were coded by the DNA, go out, and you get an immune response. And for the DNA-based ones, they have been working on Zika, malaria, and HIV. So if you remember the other slide we looked at, which showed you the immunology, this is where we are today. It's much more complicated. We're not going to go through it all. Every time I look at this slide, my eyes roll. But basically, bottom thing, you get the foreign protein, it gets into the cell, and then you get the T cells, which make the T cell helper cells. They make which then make the B cells and the memory cells and the plasma cells and the killer cells. So that's probably the most important thing. Which leads us to the COVID mRNA vaccine, which I suspect every person in this room knows about it, and I suspect most of us have gotten it. The original vaccines, the ones that we got, the first ones that were available, that was a spike protein. They took the protein on the COVID and they developed immunity to that antigen, that protein. They didn't refine it, so there were a lot of different proteins that they were using. And what it did was it modulated your immune response. So they just made the spike protein not efficacious. But the problem is you get antigen drift, which means that the proteins, the antigens, keep changing. And so your original vaccine doesn't work when you get this drift. So for all the people who keep saying, why do I have to get so many vaccines? Because this virus keeps drifting and keep changing. It's, that's not uncommon. So I want to give praise to Catalin Carrillo. She is a scientist, and she laid the scientific groundwork for mRNA. The university which she worked with refused to give her tenure, refused to finance her research. Everybody thought there was no good research in RNA. It was all in DNA. So she left the university and she joined biotech in 2013. And with Drew Weissman, they developed the technology. They furthered her work that she had been working on for years. And they developed the technology for COVID vaccine. And she was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine. Her research has saved just millions of lives all over the world. So this is how the mRNA work. And what you do is you get the presenting cell goes into the cell, the RNA, and in a part of the cell, which is called the endosome, there's a ribosome, which translates it into proteins. They go out and makes, going back to the B cells, the memory cells, and then they get destroyed. So where are we with mRNA vaccines? What's really cool about them is because you don't have the whole virus, you're not going to get sick. So you can get protection without the risks. The vaccine modulates the immune response. Okay, so it's important to understand that there's a difference between cure and immune and just preventing bad disease. The problem with the COVID vaccine is it'll start multiplying within 2 days. If you haven't had a vaccine, it can take 2 weeks to build up your immune system. If you've had a vaccine, then you'll get some immune within a couple of days. So you may not get no disease, but it will help your immune response so you don't end up real sick and end up hospitalized or end up dead. So people complain, well, I still got it. Well, yeah, you got it, but not too bad. And what's really cool about mRNA vaccines is the research they're doing is they're trying to put multiple diseases in one vaccine so that you get one vaccine and you get immunity to 5, 6 diseases. And that's where the situation is right now, except that there's no more vaccine funding. So I can't tell you what's going to happen with that. Now, I showed you how all the kids were lined up to get their polio vaccines. So when the first vaccine for COVID came about, instead of having all the kids lined up, and some of those kids that lined up were probably some of the people driving the cars, what we did was we had the cars line up. And this is me. I volunteered at a vaccination center during the start of the COVID pandemic. And this gives you an idea how early it was, is because there were no N95 masks, and a friend of mine was very sweet and made me a very cute Minnie Mouse, since I'm a pediatrician. And I worked at this a number of centers. Okay, now we're going to talk about herd immunity, because there are a lot of people who don't quite understand how this works. So the little brown guys, are the sick people, and the blue guys are the ones who have no vaccination. So you have one person who's sick, and he manages to just spread it basically to everybody, because he spreads it to one person who then spreads it to another one, and you get mass disease. And you see that if you do have, okay, so that's no vaccination. If you have vaccine coverage, which below the threshold for herd protection, and each virus is different. Measles is just the worst. You have to have 95% of the people protected, or the disease just goes wildfire. So in the third one, it shows how herd protection works. So you have, again, the same person who's infected, but he's surrounded by people who have been vaccinated. And so even though there are some people in the herd who are not vaccinated, it doesn't get to them because the people around him protected. And this is really important. And it's important to understand between elimination and eradication. So elimination is you get rid of it completely. We're kind of done that with smallpox, except for labs and whatnot. But you only can eliminate a disease if it only infects humans. So what drives epidemics? There are two aspects. And one is for people poor access to medical care. And also the unvaccinated people who declined to get vaccinated. So in 1990, there was an epidemic in Philadelphia. And there, the disease started with poor medical care. The people didn't have vaccines or couldn't afford them or couldn't get to the clinics. And then there were those who refused vaccine. So you got all the ones who couldn't get access, and then it got spread to those refusing vaccines. In Texas, which is what's going on right now, the reverse occurred. You had the people refusing vaccines who then spread it to the people who couldn't get the vaccines. And this is in the Netherlands in 2013. And this, again, shows you how herd immunity works. If you don't catch it, you can't pass it on. So on the red slide, it shows a measles outbreak. And this was in 2013. On the blue side, it shows you the percentage of people who got vaccinated. So you can see in the middle of the blue, there's just a band of people whose vaccination rates were either under 80% or 80 to 90%, which is with measles, you have to have 95%. So if you look on the red, all the people who didn't get adequate vaccination, the disease spread. So I live in California, and in the US, the endemic measles were eliminated in 2000. Well, if you go to 2014 in California, there was a bunch of measles cases. What happened is some people outside of California came to Disneyland, which happens all the time, and the measles got spread throughout the park. Some of the people who got measles then decided, well, it's better to get the disease than the vaccines. And so what they did is they went from Southern California to parts all over California and they had measles party. Invite your friends over. If your kid hasn't had the disease, we'll give it to them. And so what ended up happening is we had a whole lot of cases of measles in California. So in 2015, the SB 277 got passed. And what that did was it said that we eliminated personal belief exemptions to vaccines. So you couldn't just say it's against my religion or it's against my belief. Your child had to be vaccinated or they couldn't go to public school. It didn't make anybody actually get vaccinated. It just said that if you're not vaccinated, you can't go to public school. And then what happened was, this is California, okay? So after they got rid of your personal beliefs, people then all switched over and got medical exemptions, okay? And a lot of those medical exemptions were kind of hokey. And so Dr. Richard Pan, he's a pediatrician. He was in the California legislature. We all have we owe him because he went and he got passed the next vaccine law, which said the only way you could get a medical exemption is there would be a panel of doctors, very specific panel, that had to approve of it. An individual physician could approve one or two people, but if you were one of those docs who was giving lots of medical exemptions, it was based on making sure those people couldn't do that. The end result is in California, and again, I said it, private people people who go to private school could do what they wanted to. But in public schools, the medical exemptions dropped to 0.7. And I want to quote Dr. Richard Pan. I have a debt of gratitude. He made my life so much easier. Frankly, trying to refuse vaccines when your child needs it is an issue of privilege. What you are doing is relying on everyone else to vaccinate their children to protect yours. And I can tell you that was my experience. My practice was in West LA, and I had a lot of patients, upper middle class patients from Santa Monica, and they were not vaccinating their kids. And when I talked to them, their attitude was, I'm not going to do it because everybody else is going to do it and I don't have to worry about it. Okay, this is today, 2023, 2024. The important thing are the colors. Black means you have good herd immunity, and blue means no, and purple is it's totally not adequate. I will point out that California has great herd immunity, and again, we get to thank Richard Pan. And this is the measles outbreaks by county. And the important thing is, looking where there's a lot of measles outbreak, and we all know it. It was in Texas. It spread to New Mexico. But the important thing is looking at the next slide. There are two important things on here, imported and local. Listen, California has a lot of visitors. So the red circles, we had a lot of imported cases of measles. They did not spread. We had a few locals, and they didn't spread because of the laws in California. And that's not true everywhere else. Okay, now we're going to switch over to social media. In going back a ways, in 1759, and we're looking at what social media was in those days. Ben Franklin, who we already quoted, and Dr. William Heberden wrote a pamphlet entitled Some Accounts of the Success of Inoculation for the Smallpox in England, and just said, this is how you do it. I mentioned the Salk, Sabin, and the Cold War, which again was social media politics. And now we get to 2007. There's Jenny McCarthy, Kennedy, today's Kennedy, and Jessica Biel. Okay. And Jenny McCarthy swore up and down that the MMR vaccine is what gave her child autism. A number of years later, it turned out that it wasn't the vaccine. Her child, and this is really sad, her child had Landau-Kleffner syndrome, which is also called infantile acquired aphasia, epileptic aphasia, or aphasia with convulsion disorder. And so the child had a very horrible disease, but it wasn't because of the vaccine. Jessica Biel, who's an actress, she says she was an anti-vaxxer, but lobbied against the medical exemption bill. But we haven't heard from her since it got passed. And then there's Kennedy. He made $2.5 million off of suing one of the entities that he is now regulating. And it appears, although I can't swear to this, he will be continuing to getting a take of the lawsuits from his old practice. Polio. This I found fascinating. I'm not even going to try to pronounce his name, but the father of the Taliban, he was an Islamic scholar, and he issued a fatwa supporting the polio campaign, which was really important because the only cases of polio in those days, the early part of the 21st century, were in the Middle East. And in Pakistan, the social media spread rumor vaccine that causes fainting spells or death. So we lost, Pakistan still has polio. Just to give you an idea of what the social media has done, in 2018, there were 8 cases of polio. We had almost had it eliminated. In 2024, there are 670 cases. So we're not eliminating. Facebook. We all know Facebook. These days, they will not remove incorrect info. They just make it difficult to find. And basically what they do is if you share false content on Facebook and Instagram, you might have restrictions. You might have reduced distribution. You might be put lower in the feed so you can't make as much money. And, and those are on the platforms with news page restrictions. Google continues to generate substantial amount of money by placing advertisements on websites responsible for fake news. That's social media today. And then there's Mark Zuckerberg. So in January 2025, they replaced the fact checkers. They went to this adopting community notes. But outside of the US, Meta continues to use independent third-party fact checkers to review and rate false information. So I don't understand why they can do it internationally. Why we don't get that done in the US? Okay, so we have we have celebrities and influence tooting cures on television and social media. And it says the FDA must keep pace. And this is how Wiley is doing it. He attempts to obliterate social media. He says, sign my petition. First Amendment proposal. Knowledge shall be required before voicing an opinion. And so my little baby needs to understand that, he needs to think about it. Right now, there's the disinformation dozen. They produce 65% of the shares of anti-vaccine misinformation on social media platforms. So here we go. Here are the dirty dozen. You may recognize a number of these people. So what's going to happen to those people? The karma queue. You have the anti-vax station, all our dirty dozen. They have to wait until the people you infected have gone in, and these are all the people they infected, but they're getting into heaven. The media VIP section, no such luck. So that gets us into today there are three prominent anti-vax influences: the wellness homesteader, the conspiratorial fashionista, and the evangelica mother. And there's Texas. In Texas, parents are fighting vaccinations, saying their movement is winning. And this is one of the parents who says this. And this was a story in the New York Times. And the quote was, people tend to be very independent minded. They're free thinkers. They do their own research. Mr. Henrik, mayor of Odessa, said, whether you agree or disagree on the vaccines, I personally think it's a matter of personal opinion. Well, for those of you who are listening, and I'm giving you some of the research, I suspect there aren't many people going into the detail. And, a personal opinion, I would just bring you back to Galileo. He was tried by the Roman Inquisition in 1633 and spent the rest of his life under house arrest. So, there were the people who didn't believe that the sun circled the earth. And then there was Galileo. And I personally do not think science is a matter of personal opinion. Then there's science by text. So the CDC leaders learned of new limits on COVID shots. They just got texts saying, this is what you're supposed to do. This is a duplicate side. Now you can actually read it. The issues for parents today, 1 in 6 parents have delayed or skipped at least one vaccine for their children. That used to be true in California, but with the rules about getting into public school, we are in much better shape. But 81% of the parents in the US say that public schools should require students to get the measles and the polio vaccines. They also still believe exceptions for medical and religious reasons. They are concerned that not all recommended vaccines are necessary or safe. And the people who are least likely not to vaccinate are people who homeschool their children, about half of them, white parents who identify as very religious, and Republicans. And unfortunately, today, the confidence in federal health agencies is very shaky. 14% only have a lot of confidence, and then it goes down from there. So we need to have a public discussion. What can we do? It's important to say vaccine science has uncertainties. If you've listened to this talk, you know about it. And good science is foundation for good policy, but science is complex. We need to have humility when we're applying science. I used to have to talk to my patients a lot about the pros and cons of vaccines, what their risks were, and say, there's stuff we don't know. But we need to have good public health policy. There's a small group who adopted uncivil tactics, which takes away from what is important. And the range of vaccine skeptics has increased significantly. So we need to change the dialogue. We need to continue to do research, which we are not doing because we don't have funding. We need to keep an open mind. What you believe today may not be true. For those of you who know, there are many things we used to do, then we stopped doing them, and then we do them again. Leeches is one of them. We used to use leeches. Then we stopped using leeches. Now we use leeches again. You have to respect those with different views. If you don't respect them, you can't have a dialogue. And I can say that from experience, how important that is. You have to be responsible and civil. I would give people information. I thought the parents had the right to make up their own minds, but they need to understand their kids couldn't go to public school. And public health must weigh public health versus individual freedoms. And so I want to end with the Supreme Court, back to the Supreme Court in 1944. This is what the Supreme Court said. The right to practice religion freely does not include liberty to expose the community of the child to communicable disease, or the latter to ill health or death. So we are going to end, and I just want to let you know, some of you will receive a placebo, and the rest of you will also receive a placebo, thanks to the new CDC guidance. Thank you very much for listening. I'm done.
Thank you, thank you. Does anyone have any questions that they'd like to ask Dr. Vicky Paterno?
I have a question. Can we just like speak or do we have to
Yes,
type in a
sorry, go ahead
chat?
and unmute yourself.
Okay. So, Dr. Paterno, I really love your presentation. It actually made me like aware of what's happening in the world right now. And like for me, I have a really like a personal question that I brought to this workshop. It's like so when I was young, I got chicken pox once. And then I recovered, right? But afterwards, I got chickenpox again. So like in my mind, what I'm thinking is like if I got infected, I got like antibody in my body. But then like why did I get infected again?
Okay. I'm not sure how old you were when you got chicken pox the first time. I'm suspecting you were young. And what
Yes.
happened was, particularly for those before the chicken pox vaccine was available, mothers had a fair amount of immunity to chickenpox. So when they were pregnant, they passed on that immunity to their babies, which would prevent babies from getting chickenpox until they could develop their own immune system. But depending on when that immunity wore off and when they got exposed to chickenpox, they might get a mild case, but you don't develop good immunity depending on your age. And so though that group of people would get chickenpox again. And then they
Okay.
had immunity.
Okay, let's hope I have immunity right now. Okay, thank
Yes.
you.
Well, can I add something to that, Vicky? When you have chicken pox, the virus remains in your body. It remains in nerve cells in the dorsal ganglion of the spine, and they can become reactivated when one gets older, during times of immune stress, for example. On the other hand, when you get the vaccine, and I think Vicky had talked about this earlier, you prevent the disease. It's not that you get infected with the virus and get better from it quickly. If you don't get the virus at all, then it doesn't remain alive but dormant in your body. When you got the chickenpox infection, it remains dormant in your body, and most people, nothing happens. But in some, it gets reactivated later. So the point of the vaccine is so you don't get the virus in the first place.
Well, the development of that vaccine was really interesting. It happened, they were developing it in, let's see, Rachel was born in 85, in the early 90s. And John's laughing at me. And the problem with the vaccine was it didn't get FDA approval for a long time because the concern was that if you gave the vaccine, then you were setting people up to get zoster when they were old, and they really had to prove that that didn't happen. So it turns out if you got the disease, you're at risk for zoster. If you got the vaccine, it appears that you're not at risk for zoster. And the mechanism of how the vaccine works and how it gets spread is more than I want to go into right now.
May I go next?
Go ahead. Hi,
Oh,
Kevin.
hi. Sorry. Thanks, Dr. Paterno. You said something really interesting, and it's that female mothers can, I guess, propagate their immunity to children for a defined period of time. Is that I'm not a bio. I actually do astrophysics. Can you abuse this mechanism to give like a grace period to newborn infants so that you can administer like more potent vaccines into them afterwards?
Okay, I didn't hear the first part of your question, and you're referring
Sorry.
to something.
You said that mothers could
Oh,
almost
okay,
like give a
mothers.
certain grace period of immunity to their
Yes,
babies. And
yes.
so is this mechanism abusable? Say, can you prolong this mechanism long enough?
No, you
So
can't.
oh,
No,
okay.
you cannot. Those basically you are passing on antibodies into the
Yes.
baby, and those are going to break down at a very certain specific time. Now, there is some indication that women who breastfeed, certain number of antibiotics will get through to their baby, so that's for certain things, but not completely. And the problem with vaccinating all the moms who've gotten vaccinated and didn't get these diseases, their immune system isn't quite as robust. And so before we used to talk about chickenpox, you'd have immunity up to a year of age, and now it's not quite so long. So
Ooh,
that
okay.
is a problem.
Thank you.
However, if you get herd
Mhm.
immunity, it's not an issue.
Ooh, right. Can I follow up on that?
Yeah, sure.
I'm not sure if this is the right question to ask. To what extent is herd immunity determined by like cultural factors? So like where I'm from, for at least construction workers and a lot of like the farm workers, like sharing the same water bottle is like it's the norm. So I'm wondering if like certain cultural, I guess, norms, or could you say even like tropes propagate or make herd immunity harder to achieve?
It depends on the virus. So if you go back to polio and you see those kids lined up, that disease is spread through stool. So people don't wash their hands, that sort of thing. That's a problem. Whereas certain respiratory viruses spread differently. They threat, cough, and whatever. So I think I think it's more a problem that they don't have access to medical care, so they don't get vaccinated as opposed to cultural practices. I think that's a major problem, and that's what we've seen. If you get vaccinated, it doesn't matter how your culture approaches something, you're immune.
I see. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Any last questions before we log off? I know everyone um, has a big week ahead. Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Paterno. Again, we appreciate you taking the time uh, to present to us and I'm sure lots of us, including myself, learned lots of new things. So thank you, thank you.
Good, thank you. I really enjoyed putting this talk together, and I will say I was up to date as of yesterday, but each day something in my medical feed tells me, oh, I need to put this in my talk, and that's been going on for the last 2 weeks. So I'm glad this talk is done so I can stop having to update it. Thank you very much. I had a good time.
Thank you, thank you. Have a great rest of your Sunday, everyone.